So one final question on this before we move on, and I'm doing the two-finger thing.
That's right.
Let's go a little bit further on this, and in particular around when there is disagreement, right? So you've gone through the process that you've talked about, and there's still disagreement. And for example, Jeff Bezos talks about this. Apparently, in Amazon, there's a saying, look, can you disagree with me, but can you commit? You know, that disagree but commit. Can we move together? And I've always seen that, and I like that, and I've used that personally in my own career. But I think when particularly we're dealing with RIAs and we're dealing with like that decision making at the top, let's say we've got that group of 7 founding partners or whatever it is, right? Much of the conversations where there are going to be disagreement is going to be stuff that's almost kind of like personal, and it's going to require quite a lot of maybe action or change for each individual. Like the simple kind of conversations like, hey, should we hire a COO or something like that? That's actually, you can look at that with data. That I think most teams would come together on the right decision. What if it's about, hey, look, we're all 7, we were like founding partners, we all had our book of business, but it's now 5 years later and I'm growing faster than you're growing. Should I maybe get more equity now, or should I maybe get more compensation now? That's personal. That's and whatever's decided, it's going to have a real impact on my life. What do you advocate when it's that level of like disagreement?
Well, I'm going to use a big word here, and what we'll do is we'll pull it apart and try to turn it into a practical set of guiding principles for this sort of thing. That is to say, what's called a superordinate principle, or a superior, larger scope principle. The scenario you just described, I've seen 100 or more times in my consulting. And
exactly.
These scenarios happen largely because groups come together in a hurry. They are overly optimistic about the benefit of affiliation, oftentimes because there's some, you see it in the wirehouses that they hit a higher point on the grid and everybody gets a bigger payout, blah, blah, blah. But there's frequently in terms of the constitution of these 4 or 5 or 6 founding partners, right? There's this sense of we'll come together, we'll all establish this shared, whatever it is, the shared return, and we'll move forward and everything will be fine. We'll all be friends and we'll all work it out. And so there's no thought, or very little thought, to how do you adjudicate decisions going forward. There's not a structure created. One of the most basic pieces of guidance that I give advisors is, if you're building a business partnership, in the partnership agreement, you need to specify how entitlements are calculated and what are the principles that inform when entitlements are shifted. And we enter into the agreement not just where we are today, but assuming that if this works, the rising tide will rise all of our boats. But if somebody begins to rise much faster for whatever reason, let's say I am at a different stage of interest in my life, I'm satisfied with my revenue stream, but somebody is not, they're more hungry, and they begin to outstrip. Well, that inequity, you cannot, no human organization at all can tolerate somebody rising up but not receiving the reward for the rising up. Yet this person here, who maybe doesn't want to work that hard, will want to keep their share of that return. No human willingly gives that up unless there's a superordinate principle that is established that informs everyone in the decision of how we are going to deal with these issues going forward. So what I can say to most groups is, as you come together, or if you're still in the early stages of coming together, maybe you've only been constituted in this organization for 1 or 2 or 3 years and you haven't yet run into one of these toxic entitlement conflicts, sit down and create the principles and the structures that will inform the possibility of these things happening. How do we understand survivorship? How do we understand if somebody wishes to cut back in their time, how much entitlement do they get to reserve? How much will they give up? What are our thoughts about that? If we're talking about it together academically, and maybe the CEO has driven it and said, look, so we can avoid future conflicts, let's put some work together to make this, kind of business continuity and business transformation plan. Let's make it articulate. Let's make it explicit, as it were. The group, if they're talking about it academically, are able to get to kind of rational conclusions that are, protective of everyone's equity, as it were. Once you get activated emotionally, you have much less chance of that working out. Now, that being said, Gordon, you're not going to be able to create a set of explicit principles that covers every eventuality. There will be human dynamics that you can't predict. In those cases, now it becomes a tactical issue of conflict management. Ideally, the CEO will work very hard to stay out of overt conflicts, picking sides, for example, in the interest of protecting the interest of the larger. But this, again, is where superordinate principles really become important. Do we all have an understanding that in this room, we are representing both our own interest and the larger interest of the group? Are we operating with that so that someone else in the room could say to you, Gordon and I are having a conflict and I want this and Gordon doesn't want me to have that. Somebody else in the room could say, Ken, are you approaching this decision with the right balance between your self-interest and the interest of the larger group? If I've agreed that that's the organizing principle of our time together in this leadership moment, that calls me back to this larger principle, and that can, call me back into that. So it's important to have explicit kind of, here's how we work this stuff out, but importantly, it's also important to have these other larger philosophical dynamics. Last word here, if you're the CEO, and you can do this as the CEO even if you're in a conflict with someone, is to put the issues of the conflict out, and I mean this quite literally, out on the table. And once the issues are out of between you and me, if I say to you, Gordon, you and I are having a conflict, I say, I'll tell you what, Gordon, you and I seem to be at an impasse. Let me see if I can represent what I understand is your side of this. You see how I'm putting my hand out there? So I'm going to physically, this is a metaphor, I'm going to physically stack up your issues. And so let's say you have 4 passionate issues that I've heard. And I say to you, Gordon, I think your 4 issues are this, bump, 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 as I've heard you. And you say, yes, those are my 4 issues. And I can say, okay, well, let's hold that right here. Those are all really important issues, and I think I understand them. I may not agree with all of them, but I think I understand them. Would you say I understand them? Yes. Let me make sure my 4 issues are over here. And here are my 4 issues. Does that make sense? Okay, so as you look at this, Gordon, you and I, where are we fundamentally in disagreement? On what issues? I think 3 of these issues we're not in disagreement. 1 issue we are. As you look at it, is there any way, as you see it, that there's a middle ground or a place where you and I can come to resolution about that? Now, what have I done there? What I've done is I've tried to take the emotionally activating issues and push them out of our bodies and get us out of this sense of I'm protecting my stuff, and I'm putting it out on the table where we can look at it together. And once I get us both on the same side, or the same side, looking at our problem together, one of the things that's true about these groups is people don't come together and put these partnerships together because they don't like each other, right? There's almost always a sense of very high positive regard, oftentimes years of colleagueship, a sense of empathy toward each other. And it's only when you get, places where, those kind of vulnerable areas, oftentimes in financial services around compensation or revenue or reward, that you kind of activate these emotions. But what'll happen is if you can get it out of you and out on the table and described in this way, it's interesting how the natural empathy then tends to gentle each person's side and say, well, you know what, I'm not that invested in this. Or, yes, I don't want to take that big of a revenue hit, but I do see that we need to do something about that. It's not fair for you to be growing and me to be profiting without commensurate effort. And what you're hoping for in that regard is that the group you're working with is able to be self-reflective and self-aware. If that's the case, if you have all these other things going on, you're intentional in your communication, you're building stories and metaphors to draw the case, you're listening first, empathetically calling people in, you've created some principles by which we're going to organize and make decisions. What you're going to find is pretty quickly the group gets in a flow with this thing, and it works really well. In fact, can be extremely rewarding. Perhaps the last word here is, and I think oftentimes this is the actual driver for why successful financial advisors want to affiliate that way and want to be part of a larger group. This can be a very lonely occupation. You spend a lot of time with clients. Clients are typically not peers. You're doing hard work that has a tremendous amount of rational burden, but also emotional impact. And having colleagues that you are journeying with and that are a safe place to come to, that you understand each other, that you're yoked together, pulling together well, that's a really powerful need in most people, to have that sense of affiliation and belongingness. And I think without those things in mind, these committee-like structures can work really well, and perhaps even better than a more command and control structure.